Right, I'm going to talk to you about sensory processing and sensory integration. Right, you'll hear both terms. You'll hear sensory processing disorder or sensory integration dysfunction. And those two terms are kind of used interchangeably. People say both those descriptions and they use them to describe the same thing, really. Actually, sensory processing is how our brains process the information coming in from one sense, whereas sensory integration is how our brains get the information from lots of different senses at once and make sense of the world. Now, it's probably more common for you to hear about sensory processing disorder. Most children, in fact, almost all children with autism have some degree of sensory processing difficulty, but an awful lot of children with ADHD do as well. And I'm going to talk about 8 senses. So you'll all be really, really familiar and very confident understanding 5 of them, but sometimes the other 3 need a little bit more explanation. Proprioception is the sense that's in your muscles and in your joints, and it tells your brain what position your body's in. So even if your eyes were closed right now, you would still know whether you've got your legs crossed or whether you're sat down or whether your arms are folded, because there's information from your muscles and from your joints going straight to your brain to tell you whether your muscles are stretched or relaxed, whether they're tense or whether there's pressure on your muscles. Then there's your vestibular system, and that's in your inner ear, deep inside your ear. There's 2 systems really. There's some little circular canals that have little hairs in and little grains, and they tell your brain whether your head is moving in a rotational movement, if it's like if you're on a roundabout or a roller coaster. But they also just tell you if you tip your head on one side. And there's also other little bones, similar system, deep inside your inner ear that help you, telling you what position your head is in. So again, if you have your eyes closed, you still know whether you're lying down or whether your head is tilted. And those 2 systems, the proprioceptive system and the vestibular system, work really, really closely together to tell you all about what your body's doing. And they help you with posture, okay? And they help you with balance and everything about what position your body's in. And they get information from touch as well at the same time. So right now, your brain knows all about what your body is doing, because you can feel your seat and on your bottom, and you can feel where your feet are on the floor and the inside of your shoes. But at the same time, you're getting information from your muscles and your joints and your inner ear. Okay, and then there's interoception, and that's another sense that people didn't know about really till a little while ago, and that's all about the inside workings of your body. It's like touch, but it's deep inside you. So that's how your brain knows whether you're full or hungry, whether you're thirsty, whether you need the toilet, all those sort of things, whether you've got a bad tummy ache, anything like that. That's interoception. Now, all those senses are all over your body, and they all send messages to your brain. And that's how our brains learn about the world, even from being a tiny baby. As soon as you're born, or even before you're born, you start learning about the world around us. Okay, here's some pictures just to remind us what proprioception is, because proprioception, our proprioceptors in our muscles and joints, they are stimulated whenever we do hard physical work. Anything at all. Things like running around, dancing, jumping, playing on trampolines, jobs around the house, all those activate your proprioceptors. But also deep pressure, having like a massage, or a deep bear hug, a big squeeze on any part of your body, that activates your proprioceptors as well. And it's really important we understand that, because proprioceptors is quite important for sort of feeling good about ourselves. Sorry, I'm just admitting one other person. Let's hope someone who joined. There we are. So proprioceptors kind of make us feel good quite often as well. All right, so it's important we understand about proprioceptors, and some few pictures just remind you of the vestibular system, because we need our vestibular system to have really good balance for all sorts of things. Even just sitting still, we need our vestibular system to be working right. Even when you get undressed, you take your jumper off over your head. If your balance isn't good and your vestibular system isn't quite working quite right, then it makes us unsettled, and it makes things like getting dressed and getting changed difficult. Okay. And some of you will have, your children will do all sorts of funny things around interoception, like not feeling pain, or maybe having trouble toilet training them, or all kind of things can go wrong if our interoceptive system isn't working quite as it should. And we'll talk more about that later. So all these senses, those 8 senses, they all work really closely together all the time. And it's really, really important that we all understand how many senses are involved all the time, because sometimes we tend to just think about the first sense, the most important sense, like these 2 little boys. We know that they're eating their tortilla chips. So what do we think? What senses might they be using? You know, first of all, we might think, well, they're using taste, aren't they? That's the sense that kind of initially comes straight to mind, you know, when you see a child eating. But they're using lots of other senses as well. They're using a touch, aren't they? Touch with their fingers, but they're also using touch inside their mouths. That's really, really important, especially if you've got children who are fussy eaters. We need to understand that eating is not just about taste, it's about texture and touch inside your mouth, but also proprioception, because the muscles in our mouth and our jaw are being activated when we eat. And what else have we got? We've got taste and smell. Those are activated when we're eating food, or even when we're just looking at food. We've got balance, because we have to sort of keep ourselves upright. That's activated too. Have I missed anything there? Sound. Right, sound's really, really important, especially when it's crunchy food. So there's loads and loads. In fact, I think all 8 senses are probably activated when you're just eating a bowl of crunchy food like that. And it's important that we get used to kind of unpicking and looking at activities and seeing which senses are actually being used. Now then, in order to understand how this works, we have to think about thresholds. This is like a scale, and at one end of the scale we have a low threshold, and at the other end of the scale we have a high threshold. Now, if I just explain it to you, thinking about pain to start with, do you know anyone who has a low pain threshold? If you do, someone with a low pain threshold, they're probably, they feel pain acutely. My daughter, the one who's stuck in Singapore at the moment, when she was a little girl, she was a right drama queen, actually. I couldn't understand how she used to make such a massive fuss about every tiny little bit of pain. You know, she'd fall over and it was like the end of the world. Later on, I learned that she has a low threshold. She feels pain more intensely than I do or the rest of the family. I guess I'm somewhere about in the middle of this line. Her sister is much, much higher up the line. She has a high threshold, and she's kind of comes across as quite brave, quite stoic. She puts up with pain without making a fuss. Now, that line, we can use that line for any of those 8 senses. So if you think about your child, and you think about any one of those senses, think about sound, for instance, you might know whether your child has a low threshold for certain sounds, or is somewhere in the middle, or has a high threshold. And it won't be the same for all sounds, because there's different types of sounds, aren't there? So there might be certain types of sounds that your child has a low threshold for, but there might be other types where it's more in the middle or higher. And we could do the same for taste and smell and anything at all. With our children are somewhere on that linear line. But it'll vary as well, because when we're tired or we're not well, we probably have a lower threshold usually. I know that in the evenings, I can't cope with the sound of the TV being as loud as I can during the rest of the day. So I think my threshold for tolerance of TV type sounds goes down in the evenings. So if you just, I'm going to make that a little bit more complicated now. Right. And there's also this other horizontal line, another scale that kind of goes across this whole understanding of sensory stuff. And that's passive and active. And some of us are very passive and we just kind of deal with the world and the sensory stimuli around us without really making a fuss about it. And there's some of us are really, really active about how we cope with sensory information. And that kind of, we deal with it in a big way, in a big fuss. And you'll know whether your children are kind of at the passive end of the scale or at the more active end of the scale. Now, if I just look at these, I put these pictures in to try and help us understand. It doesn't matter what sense we're thinking about. A child who has a low threshold, so they're suffering, they're hearing, or they're coping with sensory information overload. They're getting overwhelmed by in fact, both those pictures at the bottom half of the diagram, our children are being overwhelmed by sensory information coming at them from their senses. But if they're on the passive side, they may just be very withdrawn and may just suffer in a kind of a quiet way. They may change, their skin color might change, that you might see by the expression on their face, but they're not kind of having a meltdown in the same way that a more active child would. So someone on the active end of the scale, but still down at the low threshold, they have lots of meltdowns and can be loud, they can run away, they can shout and scream, they can attack people because they're struggling to cope with the sensory overload that they're getting. Now, up at the top, if they're passive, again, they may be more quiet, withdrawn. Actually, they're kind of underwhelmed. At the bottom of the scale, they're overwhelmed, and at the top of the scale, they're underwhelmed. They're not getting enough sensory stimuli. So the passive child at the left-hand side is kind of really struggling because they're not getting all the information they need. They maybe have low arousal. They're missing out on some learning opportunities actually because they're not accessing all the sensory stimuli that we need in order to learn. Okay, so they need more stimuli to learn. Now, at the top right-hand corner is a child, is the same in that they're not getting enough sensory stimuli, they're not getting what their body needs and their brain needs and their nervous system needs, and they want to go out and get it, just like the child down the bottom, but rather than being overwhelmed, they're underwhelmed, and they are what we call sensory seeking. So some of you mentioned seeking earlier on when you introduced yourself. If you've got a child that's sensory seeking for some senses, they're in that top right-hand corner. So these are the terms that we use. And I get confused sometimes between hypersensitive and hyposensitive. So I find it easier to think overwhelmed and underwhelmed. Okay, so they're overwhelmed, they have too much stimulation from the senses if they're down the bottom, and they don't have enough if they're at the top. And your children will be a mixture of everything, probably. So for some of those 8 senses, they may be in one of those sections in one quarter, and they may be in a completely different quarter for a different sense. So you'll be able to work out whether for some senses your children are getting overwhelmed and that's making them really, really uncomfortable. And you'll be able to work out if for other senses they're being underwhelmed. And you need to sort of go through all of those 8 senses and have a little think about that, and see where you think your children are for each of the senses. Okay. And then we work out what we're going to do about it. So if they are in the bottom half, we have to decide, because they're overwhelmed and they're finding life, or a lot of the sensations in their environment around them, or even sensations in their own body, because that's what our senses do. Our senses tell us about the wider world and the information in the wider world, information in our home, things like sight and sound and smells, that tells us information about the environment, but proprioception and vestibular system and interoception, that tells us about our own bodies. So our children may be overwhelmed by the environmental. Yes, Sarah, good question. You can have a copy of the slides if you want. I'll make sure that I send them out. Because it's helpful to explain this to other members of the family, I think. So if your children are overwhelmed by certain sensory stimuli, we have to decide what we're going to do about it. They may not be having major meltdowns. They may be just passively really suffering by, like horrible smells that we can't even smell, or sounds that we can't hear. Or they may be shouting and screaming, and some children who are oversensitive to sound and find sound really uncomfortable will, funnily enough, be screamers or shouters, or grind their teeth or mutter them to themselves a lot in order to kind of mask the sounds that they don't like. They'll still, when I first learned about that, I thought this was really weird, that children who didn't like sound could still make a lot of sound themselves. But it's trying to kind of blot out the sounds that they're finding unpleasant. And they may like some loud noises. They may like the television really loud, but they can't cope with younger sibling screaming and shouting. It's sounds come in all different kind of like pitches and frequencies. And of course, like I said, it depends on how they're coping with other things in their lives as well. It's a bit like us. If we're stressed, then we're likely to have a lower threshold and find things more overwhelming. But what are we going to do about it? If we have children that are oversensitive, they're overwhelmed and they're struggling with sensory stimuli, we have to kind of make decisions about what we're going to do about it. Are we going to change things so that they don't have to put up with loud noises? Or do we try and desensitize them? And I think it's a combination of everything. Or do we also just try to be more tolerant because we understand that sometimes things are just really, really hard for them? So an example of changing the environment would be perhaps giving them ear defenders. Yeah, I can see someone, someone's mentioned that in the chat. So it's, if you put ear defenders on, you're changing the environment and you're making it a little bit easier for the child who's not coping with the loud noises. But at the same time, sometimes that's not possible, and we can't always take away everything. We can't take away all the smells, or we can't take away certain things. So we can try to desensitize our children slowly and in small, tiny steps. I'll give you an example of this. If you wanted to learn to be one of these swimmers that goes and swims in cold water, one of these crazy people, I don't know if any of you do that daft stuff, but I believe that and I've been told by people, if we wanted to learn to swim in icy cold water, like go and swim in the sea or in lakes and whatever, we would gradually build up to it really, really slowly with cold showers, or we'd go and get into a lake and we'd spend like 30 seconds in and then run out. But eventually, if we did it every day, we would get used to it and we would be able to cope better, and we might be able to stay in for half an hour eventually in cold water. And it's exactly the same. I'll give you another example. Electric, you know, the hand dryers that you get in public toilets. They're often a big problem for autistic children or children with any kind of sensory processing difficulty. And yet, and this is what I've done with several children, we have recorded on a phone, for instance, the sound of the hand dryers, and then we have played it quietly when the child's calm at home, and we've let the child maybe press stop and go. And then we've maybe turned it up a bit another day. And again, we've allowed the child to be in control of the noise. And eventually, very slowly, they get better and better at coping with the sounds. And it becomes a time when further down the line, it might take a year or two, they can cope with the unexpected sound of the electric hand dryers. So we can desensitize children. Now, obviously, you don't want to desensitize them, or you haven't got time to work on everything. So you have to pick what are the important things that you think that perhaps your child needs to be desensitized to, or whether you're just going to remove or try and remove the stimulation. Sometimes when I'm working in schools and a child can't cope with the smell of the food in the dining room, I just say, well, you know, maybe we just don't make them eat food in the dining room. You know, it's one of these ones we just have to decide about. Now, if they're at the top of the scale and they are hyposensitive, they're underwhelmed by the sensory stimuli, we have to decide what to do about it as well. Now, if they're the left-hand side, top left-hand side on this screen, the child is passive, but they need more sensory stimulation. They need more intensity. They need stronger sensory stimulation in order to get what everybody else is getting. It needs it to be stronger or longer lasting, the sensory stimulation. Children, for instance, again, I talk about sound. A child who is underwhelmed by sound may not develop language as quickly as other children because they're missing some of it sometimes. They're not hearing. Well, it's not that they're not hearing. They are hearing. There's nothing wrong with their hearing. There's nothing wrong with their hearing at all, but it's the processing of what they hear, or it's the processing of what they smell, or the processing of what they touch. So they need more stimuli, more sensory stimuli if they're in that top left-hand corner. If they're in the top right-hand corner, these are the children who often cause the greatest difficulties for their families because they are actively seeking sensory stimulation. So I heard one of you mention the word stimming. Yeah, that's the stimulation that they're actively trying to get for their brains. It's like a craving. They know what their central nervous system needs, so they go out and get it. So if they're actively seeking proprioceptive stimuli, they may try and move their muscles a lot or their joints. They may be aggressive. They may lash out at others. They may be very active. They might be little whirling dervishes. They're kind of all over the place, jumping on things, kicking things. You know, they're really active children. But they may also do things like, for instance, biting somebody else or biting yourself. That actually is proprioceptive stimuli. It's proprioceptive stimuli in your jaw, and because it activates the muscles there. If you're biting yourself, it would be proprioceptive stimuli for whatever part, like if you're biting your hand. If you're flapping, then you're activating the proprioceptive stimuli in your wrists when you flap. If you're head banging, then you're often activating the proprioceptive stimuli maybe in the front of your head, but also in your neck. So an awful lot of children's behaviours originate from seeking sensory stimuli. And sometimes we reinforce these behaviours, not on purpose, but because kind of we give a lot of attention to these behaviours as well. And so that's why we kind of set up things like it's called sensory diets or sensory circuits. Sensory diets is all about giving them little bursts of what they need throughout the day. I've put these pictures in here now because there's so many behaviours that our children do that are sensory seeking. That little boy in the top left-hand corner, licking everything. Right, licking things, that's sensory seeking for touch, or nearly always touch. It might be the texture that he's after, or it might be the temperature, you know, a nice cold. The little girl that's spinning around, she's probably sensory seeking for vestibular. The little boy there, I don't know in that picture whether he's got poo in his mouth. That's what I tried to put the picture for, because there are so many children out there will put all sorts of things in their mouths that you don't want them to put in, whether it's pebbles or leaves or paper or poo or anything at all, because of course all these things are lovely sensory things. Yes, not uncommon at all, that. And that child, it could be sensory seeking for the taste of it, or it could be the texture of it, could be the smell of it, all those things. Little boy who is playing with saliva, that's proprioception usually, because it's lovely movements of the mouth, but it can be other things too. Children often pick up saliva and make strands and play with it with their fingers and things, and that's sometimes visual. It's the sight of it, it's the reflection of the sun and the light on bubbles and on spit. It's quite common to be sensory seeking for visual things like that. Then there's aggression and biting, like I've already mentioned. These are all really, really common things. So, sensory diets. Sensory diets are giving children nothing to do with food at all. It's giving children little bursts of what they are sensory seeking for, or not actually the kind of like the behavior that they're currently doing, but it's giving them bursts of that sense that they are seeking a more intense stimulation for. So you give them little bursts of it throughout the day. So if you give them a big burst, then it usually gives their sensory system, then central nervous system, it gives them what they need, and it makes it last for a longer period of time. Little tiny snacks, little tiny bursts, maybe satisfy their central nervous system for just a little while. So you build up a timetable for the day that includes like snacks or meals of what the individual child's body is actually seeking. And there's lots of ways of doing this. Here's a little example. This was a sensory diet that I drew up for a child who kind of was very, very seeking of proprioception. They also liked kind of like touch and warm touch, but it was mainly proprioception. So first of all, as soon as this child woke up, as soon as they could get them out of bed, then it was like a warm shower, because the warm water and the kind of fast, strong jet for this child, he loved it, and it calmed him down. And also lots of deep pressure hugs, lots of big squeezes with his parents before he even had breakfast. And at breakfast, he always had dry cereal that was really, really crunchy, because he liked it, but also it was a proprioception in the jaw. Same with sucking the milkshake. By sucking a really thick milkshake through a small straw, he was activating the proprioceptors in his jaw. This little boy was able to ride his scooter to school. When he got to school, he carried a heavy box around school delivering the fruit, because any kind of heavy muscular work is what he needed. By 10 o'clock, he was starting to get agitated again, and he needed someone at school to take him to do some jobs around school or to do some little exercises. At break time, he wasn't allowed to just kind of wander on his own around the playground, which he liked to do. He had to be encouraged to play really physical games. When he was in class and he needed to listen, he needed a weighted cushion to be put on his lap, because weighted things, whether it's like just a cushion, or whether it's one of these like a long sock filled with rice or something, the weight actually activates the muscles a bit like running around does. It's the heavy weight on your muscles that gives him what he needed. And as you see, that carried on. Some of you asked for information about sensory circuits a little while ago. I'm gonna answer some of your questions in a minute. And sensory circuits is kind of like it can be part of a sensory diet actually, but it's like you're giving them what they need. And it's not just one thing you're giving them several things in a kind of longer session. So you may include things for balance, or you may include things for waking them up or calming them down. It depends very much on whether they are underwhelmed or overwhelmed. If they're underwhelmed, especially if they're in the top left-hand corner of that diagram, they probably need vestibular things to kind of wake them up a bit and get their brains fired up, ready to work, or ready to learn, or ready to listen, or ready to do anything at all. Whereas some children who are overwhelmed with everything, they need the calming things down, the things to, lots of calming activities to calm them right down. And proprioceptive things, deep pressure things, are often really calming for children. Here's a little example of a sensory circuit. This little boy on a peanut ball bouncing up and down, that activates his vestibular system, and vestibular things are often very, very calming. Not always for all children, but they can be. Then you put in the middle of your sensory diet other things that your child kind of needs as part of, to help them to be functioning at their best. And you kind of finish off with proprioceptive things or other nice calming sensory things. And those of you who didn't have the sensory diets handout, sensory circuits handout, sorry, I can send it to you. Okay, now, oh yeah, there's in this PowerPoint, there's a list of kind of like alerting activities, and there's a list of calming activities. Most of these alerting ones are vestibular, but not all. There are things here on this list like messy play, strong smells, chewy foods. All those things kind of wake you up a bit, or wake your children up a bit. But probably more useful for some of you is the calming stuff. Anything that's rhythmical and repetitive tends to be calming. So deep pressure, a massage, any physical games, not always physical stuff, but an awful lot of it is like low noise, things like lavender, things that you get common sense really, a lot of these things. They're all, the physical things are the most likely things to be calming.